Hello and welcome to Class 2 of Serials Cataloging. This week we will be diving into the RDA elements in serials records, and we're going to talk a little bit more about the MARC part of it, really in terms of which fields are used in serials records, as well as what some of the best practices are. And we'll talk more about best practices as we go along in this class. For week 3, we will do more practice-based things. We'll talk more about local series, when you might need to create a local series. We'll talk a little bit more about title changes. I'll touch on that this week, but we'll talk a lot more about it next week. When a new record is needed, and we will dive into the world of holdings records, and we'll talk about that next week too. Then week 4, we're going to talk about specific situations related to serials. So we'll look a little bit at e-serials. We'll talk about integrating resources some more, and we'll look at some of those other kinds of materials that we may deal with as part of serials too. And we'll talk more about concert and the description levels, what those are and why they matter. And then we'll kind of wrap it up, and sort of hopefully by that time you will have a sense of what makes for a good record, but we'll kind of circle back on that and circle back on sort of that idea of what makes for a good record. And then we'll peek into the future in terms of where we're going with serials. So you will have this class, you'll have the weekly discussion that you'll have been doing such a great job on. Exercises and assignments, we will have knowledge check with an exercise to work through for this week. And just to sort of review a little bit of what we talked about last week, we're not going to review too much, but a monograph is that resource that's really complete in one part, or intended to be complete with a finite number of parts. So that's kind of the sort of the fine line between the two of them. This is kind of what we think of as a book, but sometimes there are books that are issued in parts, but it's meant to be finite or have an end. On the other hand, a serial is one of those things that just kind of keeps going and going and going, or is intended to go on and on and on. Serials are continuing resources. They fall into that category of material. They are issued in successive parts. And in the olden days, we said usually bearing number. So I kind of keep this because I kind of like that definition, but that's not always true. If you see numbering, though, on a book, what appears to be a book, or anything that looks like a magazine, or anything, if you see anything that you're cataloging that has numbering on it, then that is a heads up to you that you need to do a little bit more investigation, because it is part of something else. Now, is it part of a monograph? It's part of a monographic set. That's possible. You would have to take a look at that resource that you have in your hand and kind of figure out what it is. What is it part of? But if it has numbering on it, or something that indicates numbering, then or indicates that there's more of them in some ways, then that is something you would need to take a look at. So we are going to talk just a tiny little bit about integrating resources here. And we talked about these last week, but we are going to continue to kind of talk about them because they're part of continuing resources, but they're not a serial. So we will talk about them much more in week 4, because they're kind of their own little thing, but we'll just kind of touch on them here because they are part of continuing resources. So continuing resources, as we looked at in the diagram last week, we have lots of different things. We could kind of break those categories down a lot more into all these little tiny categories like newspapers and magazines and all that kind of stuff. Or we can just kind of keep it more general and say like integrating resources and then serials, and we can break serials down a little bit more. Integrating resources, these are things that are added to or changed, so they update. One of the easiest definitions or easiest examples of that is a website. You go look at a website and it's had changes, and you can't always tell exactly what's been changed on the website, right? It just kind of, the news just kind of appears and it changes. There may be things on there that make you think like, oh, new, latest, newest, something like that may kind of tip you off that, oh, they added this recently. But it's not real clear when you look at a website exactly what has been added to it, and they're not separate. So it just kind of gets all folded into that website, right? The other thing we get, depending on what kind of library you work in, you may get a lot of these. If you get any kind of like, city planning kinds of materials. Sometimes they'll be issued in binders or like, ordinance codes and things like that. If you collect any of the kind of things like that, sometimes they'll be they'll be put into a big binder like that. And when a new one comes out, you just, get some kind of directions that tell you what to take out and put in and things like that. So loose leaf binders, loose leaf manuals, things that you're going to either put the new versions, just kind of file them within. Maybe you add them in a pocket in the back. Maybe you do something else to them, but there's some kind of instructions telling you that this is part of the other thing and it's not discrete. So it's not going to sit on its own by itself. So kind of break those two categories down a little bit more visually. We have integrating resources, and these are updates that do not remain discrete. So, you get the little update and you're going to put it into that manual, or if sometimes they're a book with a pocket in the back, you're going to stick it in the back of the pocket, or maybe you're going to take out pages and do it that way, but you have some kind of instructions telling you. Typically, you have instructions, not always. Typically, you have instructions telling you what you're going to do with that. Website, again, that's another example of something that falls in integrating resources because the updates integrate within that resource. They just get folded in there some way. So even if you have a section that says like new today or latest news or updated or something like that, it's still all folded within that single website. Whereas a serial, these remain discrete. So you can look at them, you can kind of see, sometimes if you're looking at print materials, you can see them on the shelf. You can see all the individual issues. If you're looking at something virtually, you may see individual issues listed that way, or there may be something else to kind of tell you what that is, that you can see all those little issues. So that's kind of the little dividing line between integrating resources and serials. Serials, the issues, parts, whatever you call them, they are all discrete. So they're all individual things, whereas integrating resources, you're going to replace and interfile those updates. So we are here. We're going to talk about serials and issues and really look at the MARC fields for that. So serials, just to kind of review a little bit of what we talked about, in parts with or without numbering, no finite end planned. And of course, that's the important piece of it because we do know that sometimes serials end, and especially when you think about the newspaper publishing industry, woo, did things end. But those ends were not planned. It wasn't like we're going to print 20 days worth of the newspaper and that's it. There was no plan in place for that in terms of when it would end. Now, certainly when the publishing house or whoever it was bought the various newspapers and things like that, sure, they made plans about when they were going to lay people off and when the newspaper would close, all that kind of thing. But there was no plan initially to only print a certain number or certain issues from that particular newspaper or magazine, whatever it is. They can be print or electronic. They can be both. And we're going to talk more, especially in week 4, we're going to spend a lot of time kind of looking at print and electronic together so you can kind of see what they look like in terms of kind of how those work together. And we'll talk about possible ways to handle when you have a print and electronic of the same resource. Examples of words related to serials, anything that deals with frequency, yearbooks, annuals, newspapers, news, anything that has like the word news in it as a potential, newsletter, newspapers, things like that. Journals, but not a diary journal unless they're kind of a family journal or something that's going to continue on and on. Trade publications, those kind of things. And we talked about series last time as a type of serial. So I'm not going to talk about series too much today. We'll kind of touch on them a couple of places because we're really going to just look at serial records and talk about the MARC fields. So the two kind of things to think about as we go along is sort of thinking about the ways to catalog continuing resources. And serials has sort of 2 approaches, and we're going to talk about this as we go along. I'll try to help you kind of have some insight into why you might want to do either of these. So you can catalog from the first or earliest issue available. So that would be like, if there was a magazine that came out and it was volume 1 was the first magazine, you would catalog using that volume, even if you didn't have that one in hand. And this is traditionally how we have cataloged monographic sets. If you don't have volume 1, you're still supposed to catalog from the first volume that was available from the publisher. Now, some of you are like, wow, like what if you have volume 25 and you have no idea what volume 1 looks like? Exactly. And so this is a real challenge in cataloging with this approach. And we'll kind of talk more about this as we kind of go through the records and look at them. But in theory, it sounds great to catalog from the first volume or issue. But it can be really, really hard to do, especially with serials, because serials has a tendency to be more fluid and like kind of titles and certainly like who edits them and things like that. So they're a little more, I would say, a little more fluid than like a monographic set would be, where you're not going to necessarily have the same people involved in it. Sometimes they can go over, you think about some of these magazines or newspapers that have been published for 100 years and all the different people have been involved in them. It's a little bit more fluid of a situation than, say, like an encyclopedia that, maybe just a small group of people kind of oversaw the production of it or something like that. So, first or earliest issue available sounds great because, you would know that, well, I'm cataloging for the first issue. So anyone looking at that record would know, what to expect. The other way to catalog, and this is the way that's recommended by CONSER, we're going to talk about CONSER in a few minutes, but the other way to catalog is what's called successive entry. And this is essentially you're cataloging from the latest issue or volume or part or whatever you have. Essentially, it's what you have in hand. So if this thing started with volume 1, but you have volume 25 and you haven't cataloged this before and there's no record in OCLC, then you start cataloging at volume 25. And that's easier in some ways from a cataloging standpoint because you have volume 25. So you can look at it and see what you have. And you're not having to try to guess about what volume 1 might have looked like. You're not having to go out and try to do research to figure out what volume 1 might have looked like. You just use what you have. And so there's an advantage in that from a cataloging standpoint. And we'll talk more about this as kind of we go along. Integrating resources, they use either they use the latest version, so successive entry, kind of like serial stuff, or they use one record and they just keep updating it. And they just keep updating it and updating and updating. So, that's sort of it's in some ways similar to, a little bit similar to serials in the fact that you can use the latest issue and catalog from that, or the latest update and catalog from that. Or the other way is that you just keep updating that record. So integrating resources, talk about serials are fluid, integrating resources are even more fluid because you kind of have these two choices. Either you create a new record when there's an update that would have a lot of different information, or you're just going to keep updating that record as you go along. And serials does this a little bit, and we'll kind of talk about like when would you update a record versus when would you create a new record. We're going to talk about that in the upcoming weeks. Right now we're just kind of talking about sort of the choices with cataloging so that when we're looking at the MARC fields, it'll make a little bit more sense. So this is what a serials record looks like. We're actually going to go through this line by line. It's going to get kind of deep into the MARC. So just hang with me and bear with me as we go through this. All right. So I will say this for the examples I've given you, do take some time to look at the, look at the MARC records in terms of the examples I've given you. I'm also going to share some of the resources with you that you can look up MARC fields. I do have the like a MARC template that I'm going to give you, and I do have some more examples of records that I'm going to share with you too. So I'll be sharing lots of things in the forum so that you'll have a lot of different resources to look at, because I think looking at more MARC resources and looking at more MARC records as you're looking at serials helps. So for serials, I think one of the biggest changes with serials versus like how we think of traditional monographs is that we're looking to describe the whole publication. Now, certainly if you have a monographic set, like you have that 26 volume encyclopedia, if you have a 26 volumes encyclopedia, you're going to describe that whole encyclopedia when you're cataloging, right? You're not just going to describe, typically, you're not just going to describe volume A. It makes much more sense to, describe that 26 volume encyclopedia because that's how the publisher, that's really probably how the publisher is going to try to sell it to people. And that's how they're going to be kind of looking for it. And they may want volume A of that 26 volume encyclopedia, but they still want something of that encyclopedia set. Serials is sort of the same way. When we look at it like Time magazine, we're looking at that over a specific time period. And, we're looking to describe that as a whole. As I mentioned earlier, serials records can be a little bit fluid. They sometimes called dynamic. They can change a little bit. Serials as a whole change a lot over time. And if you go in and look at serials records for, especially you start looking at maybe your local newspaper and you look at those records, you'll notice some title changes, especially if your newspaper has been around for a long time. Serials records are a little bit unique because they are often tied to not only holdings records, which we're going to talk about next week. So holdings records actually reflect what a library owns or has. So sort of that inventory aspect of it. So not only are serials bibliographic records tied to that, but they're also tied to check-in records, and check-in records are like a little record that you use when your subscription comes in. Essentially, it's just checking it in. You're just saying, yes, we received this. So at check-in records, another part of that inventory process. Check-in records are often tied to a subscription record. So depending if you're using some kind of if you're using some kind of serials management tool where you have a database with all your subscriptions in it, and then you have the check-in tool that will kind of work with that. Sometimes it works that way. Sometimes your check-in records actually work with your holding records, and sometimes it's more of a manual process. So sometimes you check it in and say, yes, we received this, and then you have to go update the holdings record. So we're going to talk more about like that part of it next week, about like sort of the mechanics of how to do that. But just to know that serial bibliographic records interact with lots of different other records in our system. And sometimes it can be within our ILS, or it can be within another vendor tool, like some kind of serials management tool we may be using. So serials are part of continuing resources. And then we have our serial title. And then the other part of it that is not unique to serials, because certainly with our 26 volume encyclopedia, that's a monographic set because we know it's 26 volumes. That's how the publisher intended it to be published and to be sold. And it's, we know 26 volumes right there. Serials, but serials are also that one-to-many relationship. So one record describing all of these things. Of course, the difference between serials and that 26 volume encyclopedia, we know that 26 volume encyclopedia, 26 volumes, we buy them all, or we only buy some volumes because we don't care if anybody knows about the what's in X to Z or whatever it may be. But as a, we still have that option to be able to buy all of those, or to acquire them, or to see them. Whereas with serials, we just don't know how many volumes or issues they're going to be, because they're just going to be as many as there are, unless we are collecting something, or someone gives us like some old magazines or something like that, and that magazine has ended. It has ceased to exist. So successive entry cataloging. This is what I was just talking about, where you use what you have, the most recent version. Any major changes result in the creation of a new record, and we'll talk much more about when you create a new record next week. And the other part of it is we use linking fields, and we're going to look at these linking fields when we get down that far in our ARC record. So that's kind of two things that are sort of elements, I guess, of a successive entry record. So how do I know I'm looking at a successive entry record? Well, this gets a little bit tricky with copy cataloging, and there are some things to take a look at. Now, for one thing, I want to point out here our dates 1974 to 2013. So this one has actually already ended. Now, at the time, we may have just got these issues of CA magazine. We may have just gotten these. These may have come in a gift box for us or whatever it may be. We may just acquired them, but that still does not mean, it still means they're a serial. It just means that they have already ended. Certainly, if we were looking at this as a copy cataloger, there's a lot of things on here to tell us that we're looking at a serial. For one thing, if you look up here where it has the bib level S, right there is your tip that you are looking at a serial. So if you see that, that's the first thing that, just start at the left side and look for that. You see that, you know that you're looking at a serial record, or you're looking with a serial type of record. So that's sort of the starting point. If you're actually working in OCLC and you're working with different templates up here in the fixed field, which is this part up here at the top, you'll notice that when you change between the continuing resource template and say a monograph template, that what's in the fixed field up here will actually change. So for example, monographs, if you're looking at a book record, they do not have a frequency field or a regularity field. And we're going to look at all of these fields in just a minute, but that's just something to kind of note that when you're looking at different types of material, and this is true for movies and music, that depending on what kind of material it is, that the information, the fields in the fixed field will actually change. There are some elements that stay the same across all different kinds of resources, type being one, the bib level being another one, the descriptive element being another, and we'll talk about each of these as we go along. So some other things that would kind of key off to sort of remind us that we have a serial or let us know that we have a serial. There's an 022 there with the ISSN. So that tells us right there, there's another tip that we have one. Certainly we have the word magazine sprinkled within, just sort of all over the place in this record. So that's a good indicator that we have a serial, but there, that's not, sometimes the word magazine is used in other ways, but all of the evidence together, including that bib level S, tells us we have a serial. So we're going to go through and look at all of these fields and talk about them because we're talking about MARC today. So CONSER, what is CONSER? Well, CONSER stands for the Cooperative Online Serials Program, and it is a national program and sort of an organization or a committee, but anyway, it's a group of people that work together to set standards for serials at a national level and also make recommendations and decisions for what a CONSER record would look like. And we're going to talk more about levels of cataloging in week 4 because they have several levels of cataloging. We're going to look at each of them, talk about them. The idea behind a CONSER standard record is to set a national level record. So kind of what would be our threshold? What is the baseline threshold that we need for a serials record, a good serials record? So what is that baseline? What are we going for? So, that's sort of what this whole group is about. And as RDA came along, they looked at like, what are we going to recommend with the RDA practices in terms of serials? So if you follow CONSER standards, you're going to have a good record, and you're going to have a record that should meet most people's standards, I would say. We will talk a little bit about where RDA and CONSER deviates, because there are a couple of places where CONSER's made a recommendation that not quite in conflict with RDA, but RDA would kind of say something a little bit different. So we'll talk about those as we go along. The goal of it is to reduce redundancy, emphasize access points, that's a really big part of it, and then simplify record creation and maintenance. And so this is a piece of it, especially when you get kind of to your own cataloging of, you know, what level do you want to do in terms of your serials cataloging? And it kind of depends upon, are you doing mostly copy? Are you doing mostly original? Are you doing a little bit of both? You know, do you want to participate at a national level? And if you do, then, you know, you need to look at some of these national programs. Monographs has sort of the same thing with BibCo. So BibCo being the monograph bibliographic side of it. And that does the same sort of thing where it's like looking at what would a standard record for a monograph look like. So the great thing about these two organizations, committees, programs, whatever we want to call them, is that these standards are published and available for anybody to look at, and anybody can use them. And I'll kind of talk about a couple of places where in the coding, if you are participating, you use a different code, but if you're not participating, you know, you have a different choice there. So I'll talk a little bit about where there's a change, but you can use and follow the standards without actually participating. And so that's always been my recommendation, is that if you can, if you have time to learn to create, and you're doing enough original cataloging that it warrants it. You know, if you only do like 2 original cataloging records a year, it may not warrant it to really, you know, try to create this really robust record. But if you do have a little handful, even a handful of original cataloging records to do every year, then I would suggest, you know, looking to the national standards, you know, looking at what PCC is doing. So PCC is the Program for Cooperative Cataloging. They're the ones that work on setting that BibCo standard, and then CONSER works on setting the CONSER standard for serials. So that would be my suggestion, is that, you know, depending on what kind of resources you're doing original cataloging for, is to really look at those national standards and sort of follow it as much as you can. You know, try to be a good steward of the data. So we're going to look at CONSER standards. Like I said, we'll talk about them as we go along. One of the things that I really like about the approach for the CONSER standard is that it's meant to be not only a list of essential data elements necessary to meet our user needs, like what do the users really need to know about serials, but it's also meant to be what they call a solid floor of description of the resource. So it's really meant to be kind of that building block, which other things can be built on top of it. For those of you who are really like to do detailed, you know, really detailed cataloging, maybe you have a little more time to spend with your original records, you can certainly do more than the standard. So there is no, you know, there's not really much limitation in terms of what you can do with the CONSER record in terms of going beyond. If you are submitting records to be part of the program, then you're gonna follow the guidelines very, you know, very strictly. You're going to adhere to them. If you're not part of the program, then you can certainly do more if you want. If you are part of the program, you can do more locally and then submit your record, you know, following that more strict adherence to the rules. And if you're not CONSER, you can certainly do less. If you are CONSER, if you are participating or want to participate in the program, we'll talk about the 4 levels at the in week 4, so you kind of know like what you might be in for if you want to participate in this. But the nice thing, as I said, about this these sort of national standards is you can look at them as a cataloger who's not participating in the program and make decisions, knowing you're making decisions based upon a national standard. And that will not only inform your cataloging and make it better, but should your library at some point decide to participate in a national level program, regardless if it's CONSER or if it's BibCo or some other program that you may participate in later down the road, at least you would have some sort of standard for your data. So you can do more, you can do less, depending on what you are wanting to do. So I've been calling this classic RDA, CONSER versus classic RDA. And the biggest difference really between CONSER records and classic RDA is what do you use to actually catalog with. And in concert, you're going to use latest or successive entry. So in my opinion, that's kind of the easiest to catalog from, because essentially you're cataloging from what you have, right? So if you got volume 25 and you know, or you suspect it started with volume 1, but you don't really know because you haven't seen the other 24 volumes that came before it, you're cataloging from volume 25. You know, if you have volume 25 and you haven't seen the other 24 volumes and you have no idea what they look like, but you're supposed to catalog from volume 1, that's a little bit tough. I mean, I know we've probably all cataloged sort of like, I think I know what I'm cataloging, but it makes it a little bit more challenging. So in that way, following concert is sort of an easy decision for serials, I think, because you follow that latest entry. RDA and before that AACR2 both you follow the first volume for serials. So for serials, you're going for original cataloging, at least, you're going to need to decide if you want to follow concert standards and use the successive entry. So use the latest. So if you have volume 25 and volume 26, you're going to catalog from volume 26. So you're going to catalog from whatever is your latest one that you have. So that's what you're going to use. You're not going to wait for other things to come in, though. Like if you've got volume 25 and volume 26 is going to be on the way, you're going to catalog from volume 25. You're just going to do your work and move on. But this is a decision you'll need to make for original cataloging and serials. Do you want to follow concert standards and use that latest successive entry, or do you want to go classic and go with that first volume? So that is a decision to make. And this will deviate from what you do for monographs, in terms of how you catalog for now, because I kind of hope at some point we're going to change how we think of monographic sets too, but we're not there yet. However, for those of you copy cataloging, yes, this may make cataloging serials a bit more tricky. And we're going to spend more time looking at specific situations in weeks 3 and 4 and kind of talking through all the different types of serials, and hopefully you'll have a good sense of what you're looking at. Encoding 7, when you see that encoding level 7, that is going to tell you that you are you're looking at a minimal level serial record. So when you see 7 in that coding level, and we're going to look at examples and talk more about it. Concert would use blank for that. And like I said, we're going to talk about that and look at it more. It's just a reminder, some things that play into all of our records all the time that we sometimes forget about. There's this thing called ISBD. It's International Standard Bibliographic Description. It is not a K-pop band. It would be a good K-pop band name, though, wouldn't it? Anyway, it is not a K-pop band, but it's called ISBD. And this is essentially the punctuation. And this is always in play in our records. And this is all that punctuation between field elements. So that's our periods or dashes, all that kind of stuff. I'll try to point it out as we go along, just, kind of as a reminder. And then of course we're in MARC 21. So yes, there was more MARC before that. And there's even pre-MARC records in OCLC, because there are records in OCLC that were created not only at the Library of Congress, but at other libraries that were digitized and created as electronic records and converted into a MARC record before there was MARC. So there are all kinds of things in OCLC. And then of course we have RDA, which we're going to talk more about as we go along. And then we have and/or concert, what we're using here. We also have authorized access points in play, and this will be our names, our name and series headings, our subject headings. We're not going to talk too much about authorized access points in this class other than series headings, because we don't really cover subject analysis in this class, and we don't really cover, creating name authorities. But I will point out some places and some things about names and subject headings when it comes to series. So serial. So I'll try to make sure to point those things out as we go along. So back to our example. Fixed field up at the top. And we're going to talk about all of the fixed field today. You're just going to either love it or hate it. Anyway, The 022 is our ISSN. The 040, we're just going to work our way down the record, and we're going to start the fixed field in a few minutes. The 040 is where our institution codes come into play. And that first subfield A, and this one is missing the subfield A, the first subfield A is the institution that input it. So this is probably a template record that somebody created. But the first subfield A tells you which institution created the record. And then you'll see down the road, they're down the road in that little, sometimes there'll be a long string with like 5 or 6 institutions. You can see all the different institutions who've updated a record. You'll often see many institution codes listed in the 040 for serials records because many different people will do something to that record. The other thing you'll see in the 040, which is important, is the subfield B is the language that's being cataloged in. And then you see that subfield E telling you it's an RDA record. So those are, it's part of what tells you it's an RDA record, but that's sort of the obvious one. The 041 is the language that's been the language of the resource. And then we have the 222, and we're going to go all the way down these in a minute, but the 222 and the 245, so the 200 range from 200 to 299 in the MARC fields. There's not a MARC field for each of those, but that range relates to titles. Then we have the 300 range, and this is our 300, and it goes really all the way down to 399. Again, we don't have a MARC field for each of those, so don't think you've got to memorize 99 fields because you don't. But that range is about the description, the physical description of that resource. And physical description does include electronic things. So it includes things like computer file and stuff like that. When you are looking, if you kind of scroll down here to the 336, 337, and 338, I kind of call those a triple because they kind of work together. But when you see the text, unmediated, and volume, you see those 3 together, you have a print resource. So one of the things we can now do with RDA records, because that's new for RDA, is that we can actually search and sort by print if we have enough of these 3 fields in our records in our ILS. So before, in the olden days, before RDA, print was the default, and there was no information on records that were print to say they were print. It was just, that's just what they were. So as we've moved to more like digital, and we have all these electronic resources, and of course we have all kinds of media resources, now we actually are coding our print resources too, so that in an ILS that can search and filter for these things, it can actually pull out print and you can actually see the print stuff. So that was a pretty cool thing that happened for RDA that, it kind of makes it nice in terms of our print serials versus our electronic serials. So scroll down a little bit more, then we get to the 500, the 500 to 599 range. That's where our chunk of notes go. And we have quite a few notes that we're going to use for serials, and we're going to talk about those. And then we get down to those linking fields. So the 700 to 799, that's where we put additional names. That's also where we put information about different editions. So we see in this one, we have the online version and we have a microfilm version. So we put other versions in, and we also link to those. And you can't really see the link. I mean, it kind of looks like a hyperlink, but you can't really see that there's a link to it. But when we look at the actual code, you'll see that there's a link to it. So I did tell you we're going to look at the fixed field. So in red are fixed field elements that are common to serials. Now that type is on all bibliographic records. So it's not unique to serials, it's just on all records. Typically, you're going to see A for the choice there, and we're going to talk a little bit more about what these choices mean in a minute. Typically, you're going to see A there for that bib level. Again, bib level is on other resources, including monographs, but we have an S there for serial. Then we have some other fields that are going to be unique to serials, and we're going to talk about these in a minute, but anything coded in red is going to be things to look at in terms of serials. So I did say we were going to dig in. So let's dig in. All right, so our type is really kind of just two choices for serials, at least. We have language format and manuscript. So unless you are cataloging, if you're original cataloging archives, you might have something that's a manuscript, or maybe if you're doing thesis and dissertations, you might have a manuscript, but chances those would be a serial is going to be very, very small. I mean, I guess a student could create a magazine as part of the dissertation maybe, and that might be a serial manuscript, but they're just not going to be very common. So typically you're going to see type A. That I would say 99.5% that's going to be what you see there. For the bibliographic level, S for serial. And then the SL is your entry convention. So this is where you can see how people have cataloged it. So for copy catalogers, this is going to be not only the encoding level, but this is going to be a place for you to take a look at when you're copy cataloging, because it will help you see whether or not the record you're looking at should match and how it should match. For example, if you have volume 25 and the record is for the record starts with volume 5 and they cataloged on volume 5, then what you're looking at may not match exactly. And you're going to have to look at that record and evaluate it a little bit more. So knowing that, see, here's entry convention is 0, which is successive. So that means whatever it would say down here in the record, and we're just looking at fixed field now, but whatever would be down here in the body of the record, they cataloged from the latest edition or latest version or latest issue they had. They did not catalog, one is for the latest and then 0 is for successive. So they cataloged based upon what they had. So if you're looking at these, this is one of those things to kind of take a look at. If there is a 0, then you should also see some 785s in a record. You won't always, but you should. If there's a 1, then 0, you're going to have links to former or earlier titles. For 0. If there's a 1, you're going to link to former titles and issuing bias. So you could have a 247, 547, or 550s, or you could have some of those other 7XX linking fields. And we're going to talk more about those in just a second. So for 2, that's the integrated resource thing. So if you see a 2 in there, so if you see a 2 in that category, that's where you would be looking at an integrated resource, or possibly for electronic serial that does not retain its earlier titles. And we're going to look at that example in week 4 exactly. So we're just kind of looking at like what some of these fields might be. So you're really going to be looking at your bib level S, and then you're going to be looking at, whether or not they cataloged from what they had in hand or whether or not they cataloged from the latest. You're going to be looking at that. And then you're also going to be looking for your description convention or descriptive convention. I is for RDA. And RDA records, you remember when I said that in the subfield E, they would have the RDA? There is that subfield E for the RDA in the 040. So you should have, in theory, if it's an RDA record, it would have the I, and then it would have the subfield E for RDA. All right, so moving on. Our encoding level. So this is where we talk about what level the record's going to be done to. Like, is it going to be a complete record? Is it going to be, fully cataloged? It's going to have authorized access points, all that kind of stuff. If it's blank, which is what Concert will use, that says that it's going to be a full record, and it's going to mean that all authority work has been done on that record if it's blank. If it's 7, that means that it's a minimal level record. And in theory, that means access points have been checked in the authority file and they should be okay, but 7 is the minimal level for a record. So your mileage may vary on that. In fact, I'm going to just say right now, your mileage will vary on that. So I would not trust, if you are copy cataloging and you see encoding level 7, I would not trust that the authorities had been checked. Now, as a copy cataloger, you have choices here. It depends upon what your workflow is. Some systems will validate and check headings for you. So if you have a system that does that, then great. You don't need to worry so much about that because your system checks it. Some of you have a workflow that's, I'm just going to accept what I get. So I'm not checking subject headings. I'm not checking name headings. And that's fine too. Some of you may have a policy that you check names, but not subject headings. There's lots of different ways of doing this. So this is where it gets to vary that much, that local policy in terms of what you do. In theory, a 7 says that the access points were checked. So somebody went and looked in the name authority file, somebody looked in the subject authority file, and they said, yep, there's a match, and they moved on. There's no real there's not significant verification saying those were applied correctly, that they used the correct subject heading or anything like that. It's just, was it there and was it a match kind of thing. So you can see where that gets to where like automated records would create these. A blank, on the other hand, means that someone actually has looked at the work and they did all the authority work needed. And so you can rest assured that, or you should be able to rest assured that that's a good record. So that's kind of a thing to kind of think about, whether or not you're going to check these if you come across one that's going to be a 7, or what are you going to do? And there's some other coding levels out there. Basically, blank is right now the highest level in terms of work that's done, and it should meet a threshold standard, whereas 7 is minimal standard and it should meet that. But I think there's a lot of minimal level records still in there that are going to be a little more skeletal. K is a really old minimal level standard that has been around for a long, long time that is going away. But there may still be some records in there that are level K records, and level K records are sometimes created through automated processes. Sometimes they're created by people who are cataloging in languages they do not understand or read. I cataloged Arabic materials one time and used transcription from a student worker who was an Arabic language instructor. So I was really relying on that student worker to transcribe the materials for me, or transcribe title pages and things like that. And so because of that, and because even using a keyboard that could input characters, not knowing the language, and even having somebody, kind of helping me to make sure I did it correctly, I did not feel comfortable giving it a higher level. So although they had subject headings, the subject headings were checked, they had a nice OCLC number, they had a nice Library of Congress call number, I did all the authority work for them and everything, still just not reading that language and having that expertise with it. It's like, nope, those are okay. Because that's I don't want anybody to look at it and go like, they completely misspelled that word. So that's sometimes what you see with level K. Sometimes people who are new catalogers or maybe don't catalog very much, sometimes they'll do level K records, so you'll still see those floating around, but they will eventually all change to level 7 at some point. The type of continuing resource, that's really where I don't see this used as much as it probably should be, but it really is where you can further define exactly what kind of resource that is. So really you're going to see this on an updating loose leaf. So there's your integrating resource, an updating database. Where, in terms of what we're talking about today, we'd be most likely to see a monographic series when we were talking about those last week. We'd see that there. Newspapers, periodicals. That's really where what we would be most likely to see that in. You don't always see this coded, and it's one of the things where I think sometimes it's just it's unfortunate that it doesn't get used more, because there is the blank, which is none or no attempt to code. So I just didn't even, I just ignored it. Didn't do anything with it. That's okay. It's blank. Blank's okay, but I do think it's useful information, especially for newspapers and periodicals. So moving over to our source, and remember we talked about source in the 040, and we'll look at some records where you can actually see that. This corresponds to what kind of organization or institution created this record in OCLC. And D is any of us that's not part of a national bibliographic or cooperative cataloging program. So if you don't contribute those records, then you're D. Yay, we're all D's. No, some of you aren't, but most of us are D's. So if you're part of those national programs, you would know it. Or if you're part of like Concert, you would know it. And if you're not, then you probably know that too. So you're D. So that's what you would see. So for copy catalogers, if you see C up there, you would know that that is somebody's participating in the cooperative cataloging program, created that record. So hopefully they created a good record, right? They're part of that program. Or if it's blank, that would mean it's part of one of the national bibliographic programs, something like BibCo. Then they should create a good record too, right? Because they're part of that national group. So if you see blank or C, so nothing or C, then that's somebody who has created that record, who has a level of expertise that should be doing a good job. So for copy catalogers, you should see a good record. Conference publication, we're just kind of moving down the list here. 0 is not a conference. And then 1 would be like conference publication. And this is where you get to proceedings and things like that. And for serials, the defining line of it is you can include conference. You can choose that it is a conference publication, put that 1 in there if there's 2 or more in your serial that is a conference publication or proceeding. So let's say you have a serial that's science, and 5 of the issues are just conference proceedings of the science conference, and there's nothing else there. Provided the name doesn't change, and provided it's nothing different, it's still the science magazine. It just has, it just has 5 issues that have conference proceedings within it. Then you could, for that one science serial title, you could code that as a 1 for a conference publication, because you have at least 2 in all of yours. Again, you can always just leave it blank and say, no, I'm not attempting to code this. I don't know. No idea. I think for serials, it's going to be more typically 0, or people are just going to skip it because they're just not going to know with the serial. Remember, with a serial, the record applies to the serial as a whole. So this gets to the nature of the entire work. And then the other one over there is the nature of contents. So nature of entire work, that is truly exactly what it says. What is the entire work about? What kind of thing is it? There are some categories here that can be useful for serials: handbooks, abstracts and summaries, indexes. Indexes is about the only one that I have seen used regularly, but there are others in here that may, I haven't cataloged a lot of yearbooks for some reason. I just haven't worked in a library that's had a lot of yearbooks, so I haven't used Y, but I would think yearbooks would be another one that would be useful. And then, not that we get a lot of serials that are graphic novels or comics, but there is now a category for comics and graphic novels. So the nature of the work can apply to other types of material out there. But in terms of serial, some of the ones that I thought sounded, or some of the ones I know of that are relevant to serials are things like indexes, certainly directories, technical reports, legal cases and case notes. Those are maybe integrating resources, but you may have some that aren't. The same thing with law reports and digests, they may be that too. But there's also the no attempt to code. You don't see nature of work used much with serial records. Like I said, I think yearbooks, it may be used some. I've seen it used more for indexes. Really depends upon the type of cataloging you're doing, what level you're probably doing. Because remember, it has to apply to the whole, it'd have to apply to that whole serial. Nature of contents, and this one is one we just really don't have much of a use for at all for serials, because this is about whether or not it's a significant part of a type. So remember, a serial record is about the whole. So nature of entire work would make more sense to pick one of the categories than to use the nature of contents, unless you have one that's not listed up here. These are almost the same, but there are some different choices. So for example, there is patent document. Chances you have a patent document and serial is probably 0, but patent document is one that's separate, that's not in the nature of the whole work. Another one that's listed down here would be filmographies. And again, you probably don't have one of those that's a serial either, but there are some different categories in the second that are not in the first. And I don't know why they don't mirror each other exactly. I don't know exactly what the thought process is for that, except that I would think that it has to do with, just the nature of those works, that they're probably going to have other material around them and it's not going to be the whole work. Government publication, a blank no, and then there's a whole bunch of categories for this. And we're not going to go through all the alphabet soup of this, but it's really goes all the way from, is it by a government agency, multi-level, jurisdiction, regional, below the state level, it's all those different kinds of levels. And if you have government publications, you're probably a little bit more versed in terms of like what the regions and the territories and, all of that sort of local and regional kind of levels of government. You probably have that, all kind of figured out. It's very, I've done some government publication cataloging. It gets very, very complex in terms of how these things are organized. In this example, ours is a state, province, territory, or dependent. So that's who published this. So the government publication category tells you a little bit about who published it. So that's not one that you typically see a lot of in serials unless you're doing GovDocs. And if you're doing GovDocs, there are quite a few serials there. So if you're doing GovDocs, you're probably going to see some of those. The two fields that you are going to be likely to see as cataloging serials. Frequency, and this is really where we get very granular in terms of what the frequency is. Is it 3 times a week, 3 times a month, continuously updated, monthly, quarterly, 3 times a year, unknown, we just have no idea. Or there's always blank, no attempt to code. If you are doing original cataloging for serials, you should, if you can, put the frequency in. And if you know what the regularity is, you should put that in. If you don't, I would say skip that. I would say frequency is more important if you know that. If you do not know these, it would be better to admit it than put something wrong in. So if you cannot tell or you do not know, then I would not include that information. I would just leave it as no attempt to code. These are not required for CONSER to input, but you will typically see them input into a CONSER record. So they would be useful to include. But like I said, don't put wrong information in. Don't guess on this one. There's other places you can guess, but not here. And for Copy catalogers, this can be useful, especially if you're looking at something and what is in the body of the record in terms of frequency. And we're going to look at that in a little bit, but what's in the body of the record in terms of frequency doesn't quite match what you have. And sometimes looking at the fixed field and kind of figuring out which of these it may, which of these it is according to the list can help you. Also, if you have something where like you are skipping issues, like you didn't get issues, or it's coming at like a weird pattern, like you get 2 and then you skip a month and then you get 2 and then you skip a month and then in the summer you get none, it's like something like that, but it's a pattern. Then you may want to look at your regularity, because like irregular in a predictable pattern can tell you that it's not gonna be every month, but it's going to have some pattern to how it shows up. And especially if you have to set prediction patterns in your ILS for your check-in record. So like, what do you expect to get with your next issue? Then, sometimes looking at that regularity can help you look at the frequency and the regularity in addition to what else is in the bibliographic record. That can give you some tips about what you need to do in terms of setting your check-in records in. Not all ILSs have check-in records, but some do. And you have a check-in record, you often have to try to kind of predict what the pattern's going to be like. Are you going to get it monthly? Is it coming every year? Is it quarterly? You have to just make this prediction sometimes, and it can be very hard to do if it's slightly irregular or it has some kind of odd prediction pattern. Control is whether or not it's archival. There's not a lot of archival serials cataloging, although there's some. So we won't talk too much about that, but you'll notice in the documentation I'm going to share with you that there's some discussion about the archival aspect of it. A modified record, that's sort of like what kind of record did you start with? Did you start with the Library of Congress or National Library of Medicine copy, that kind of thing. If you're original cataloging, you'll know what you're starting with if you're starting with another record. And then the original alphabet. This is going to be blank for all English language records. It's going to be blank for a lot of the modern languages, but there are some languages that you're going to see, like Cyrillic, depending on what you collect. And for serials, you may not see this much at all. But, you could see Cyrillic or Japanese or Chinese or Arabic, like I had a bunch of Arabic, but I didn't have any serials. So, you may never use any of these in serials cataloging, or you may, so it's there if you use it. The other piece of it then is the language, and this is the language of the item. And this is also something you need to look for in that 041 field, and then a 546 field, and the 040 field too. So lots of places, and we'll talk about those as we get to those. There is a list, and it's from the MARC language list in the MARC encoding manual, and I'll send that to everyone too, so you'll have it. A country. This is a little bit different between serials and monos. This is the place of publication for serials. It's the place of publication of the latest issue, iteration, or part, if you're using the latest issue to catalog. So that's what it's going to be. If you're using monographs, of course, what is it? It's the place that the thing was published. So that's something to kind of think about. And if you're updating the record and the place has changed, then you would update country. And you could add another 264, and you might add a 500 note to kind of explain it. So that would be something if you're doing more of either complex copy where you needed to update something in that serial record, or maybe you're even doing original cataloging. Now I want to talk a little bit about dates, because dates are so important, not only for serial cataloging, but really any cataloging. Dates will appear in multiple places within a record, and one of the places that dates appear is in the fixed field. And there is a relationship, as we've talked some about the other fixed field parts. There are relationships also between the dates and how the dates are formatted and the rest of the bibliographic record. This is especially true for serials. There are a lot of variations in practice, and older serial records may even use, instead of the C or a D, which is the most commonly things you're going to see for serial records, you may even see an M for a serial record. It would still look like a serial record, but it would have an M over here and the date publication status, and then it would have the two dates exactly as we have over here in this example. That would most likely be for an older serial record, or it might be for a serial record that would be sort of a less quality serial record. These days, typically you would see the M, because an M means multiple dates, and you're going to see the M when you have like a multi-part monoset. So a monographic, a set of books that are all on one bibliographic record, and they have an end date. Sometimes you know when the end date will be. Other times they're still being published. An author starts writing a set of books, and they're going to be done as a set as opposed to a series. A set of books, volume 1, volume 2, volume 3. They may not have written volume 10 yet, but you already know that this is going to be a 10-volume set. So although it would be, the date would still be 999 because that means an ending date at this point, there is that idea that, there is an end to that. So the difference between a monographic set and a serial, not only in terms of how we catalog it, it really has to do with sort of what the intention is of the publisher and or the author. So depending upon, is this like a work that has multiple editors and things like that? Or is this an individual author who's publishing these as a story as a whole or as a collection, maybe a collection of poetry, and they're doing volume 1, volume 2, volume 3, their memoirs, volume 1, or maybe not even volume, maybe they're publishing them by years, but they're doing it as a set. So distinguishing between a monographic set and a serial can be a little bit tricky. You are looking for things like, is there information on the particular resource about frequency, how often it's published? When you start seeing frequency, as we talked about in class 1, when you start seeing some of those words associated with frequency and regularity, that's going to be a hint that you're looking at a serial. When you're looking at a bibliographic record, not only the way that we code things, it's fairly clear that it's coded as a serial, but there'll also be other hints throughout the record, as we're talking about and looking at today, that's going to tell you it's a serial as well. If you're starting out doing original record and you have to make a decision about whether or not something is a serial or a monographic set, you have something that's multi-part, you don't know which way it leans, you're going to be looking, you may look at other things that are associated with that particular title. If there's other volumes or issues, you may look at those. You may be also looking at the language, words like frequency, annual, all of those kinds of things, magazine, newspaper, newsletter, all of those kind of clues to help you decide that this is more of a serial thing. So if you're doing original cataloging, sometimes the decision, and there's even more kind of gray areas between serials and monographs. You can have a monographic title that's actually within a serial, and there's a lot of other situations too where it gets more complex. But if you're doing original cataloging, sometimes the decision about whether or not something is a monograph that is multi-part or a serial can be a little bit hard to determine. Sometimes it can be very easy. You have something that is Journal of Education, and it's published 4 times a year, and you get it on a subscription. You 99.9% chance, without even looking at a record or looking for a record, you know that you have a serial. But dates certainly can be a place that can be a little bit tricky between monographs and serials, because of the fact that if you have a monographic set, it's going to have that same sort of date aspect to it when you look at the records. Now, certainly the other parts of the records are going to be different, but you are going to see similarities between how the dates are recorded between a multi-part monograph and a serial. So for serials, currently we use C for the date publication status, and that means that something is currently published. And you would see then an end date of 9999. Again, that would, for monographs, multi-part monographs, you're going to use M, multi-date, and that's just sort of the distinction between a monograph set and a serial. So serials will choose C or D. C meaning it's currently published, it's being ongoing, and then D means it's ceased or it's ended. Now, if you have something that has a D, you should not have an end date of 999. 999, we can't leave that empty in a fixed field of a MARC record if we have multiple dates listed, or if we have a date publication code that indicates multiple dates. So the C date is for serials. It indicates that it's currently published. And because of the nature of serials, they should have a beginning and an end date. If we have the last issue of a serial is unavailable, but we know it's ended, there is a field that we're going to put a note in later on, and we're going to look at this as we get down that way. We're going to talk about the latest issue consulted, like what did we look at? So instead for that, for the date, we need to figure out what our date is. We're just going to use for any unknown digits. Again, if the serial is still being published, it's 9999, and we can still talk about what our latest issue consultant was. However, if the last issue of a serial is unavailable, we're just really going to then figure out what our dates are going to be. So dates, in this case, we're using U for an unknown because we have no idea when this ended. We just know that we looked at in October 1946, and it looked like that it must have ended by then. It can be really sometimes tricky to kind of figure out, you know, when something ends, especially for some of this stuff. So you can always put in U's if you just have no idea when something ends. Reprints and reproductions, you're going to enter the date of the original serial as listed in the dates field above. So you're going to use the R for one thing when you have a date for the original serial. And then you're going to enter your publication dates for the reprint, and you're going to put that information within your 264. And we won't talk too much about reproductions, but you may occasionally have a serial reproduction. So it looks something like this, where you're going to put in your original information and then the previous information. So another example, this is one where we have microfilm. So we've had something that's been microfilm. So we'd have some additional information that we would add that would distinguish this. We have a 533 here that tells a little bit more information, but there's our 362 kind of telling us the range of it. And there's our date range, so showing the dates of coverage. You have a serial where it kind of walks the guideline, you know, it started in November, like November, December, you know, that kind of thing. So you're spanning 2 years. Then you're going with the latest named year and the dates. And remember, of course, you're cataloging from an issue to describe a whole. So that kind of makes sense that you would talk about it in terms of the whole year, and you're going to round up. So in that case, just round up when you have this situation for serials. Now you can in your 362 where you're actually describing the range itself, you can be very precise there. And we're going to talk much more about the 362 field in a minute. I just want to kind of allow you the chance to kind of see how this information kind of looks together. So here's the information from the fixed field. And then we have information down here. This would be sort of the range of the serial, sort of information about the serial. So this is information to kind of tell us a little bit more about that serial in terms of when it began, or if it is closed, you know, that actual date range. So for this situation, we have our dates, and we know it ended in 1956, but if you looked at it and you said, well, but it wasn't really 1956 because the last issue was November, December. So it was November 1955 to 56. So we called it 55 to 56. Or maybe it's something that is, bi-yearly. So it's going to come out and it's going to cover 2 years anyway. So you do have things that each issue kind of covers multiple years. So if you had something, let's say you had something that covers 3 years, volume 1 was 1970 to 73, and then you would put 1973 as your starting date for this. Period covered, enter the date based upon the period cover. So if you have a time period that's covered, if it's communicated to you in that resource, then you can use the, you can use that information based upon what you have. So this would be the case of where you have information in terms of what it says in terms of the copyright versus what it actually says in terms of the date that it's, the time period that it's covered. So sometimes there occasionally can be some sort of discrepancy, but we would probably explain that elsewhere in our record to kind of explain why there was that discrepancy. So we would explain to someone where we got the 1979 from so that people would know. So in terms of other things you can do, if dates are not applicable, and this really applies to some very specific information, but I want to go ahead and give them to you anyway. You have something that's a BCE date. If no day is given on a technical report, something like that. Back in the olden days, you would use U for that, but now we're really using U for very specific situations we talked about here. Now we would just kind of put a blank in for that information. And you can actually see here that, if you look, we have one UUU because we just really don't know, but we're going to guess that this cereal or whatever, whatever kind of cereal it is, we're going to guess that it is actually coming from, we're going to guess, just sort of guess the millennial, because that's really all we have. So let's look at some more examples, and then we're going to dive back in and talk more, Mark. So there's our continuing resources. There's our type. We're not going to talk too much about that. There's a bib level S. There's our information about what was used to catalog from. Let's see, some other things we can point out here. Not a conference, not a GovDoc or government publication. We have some frequency. This is regular, so we're going to take a look at that. We have our dates. We have a language listed for this, so we would need to take a look at that to see what they were choosing for that. This started in 2016, ended in 2019 or 2017. Sorry about that. And then we kind of look down here. Let's see, encoding level blank. And this one just has source blank, so nothing special about that. And so when we look down here, then so we have source is blank. So we know that that was one of the national bib agencies input that. And then of course we have our encoding level blank. So we know that means that that's going to be that high level record. And when we look down here in the 042, we see PCC, which is the Program for Cooperative Cataloging. So that's really telling us this should be a good record for copy catalogers. So that should be a clue that you're looking at a good record. Now, some other things that will make you go like, aha, I am looking at a good record. One thing, you've got DLC, which is the Library of Congress, and they actually created this record. So actually, not everybody who catalogs for the Program for Cooperative Catalog, but many people who catalog for the Program for Cooperative Catalog, there's quite a few of them that work for the Library of Congress. And so you will quite a bit I wouldn't say always, but quite a bit, you'll see PCC and then you'll see the DLC next to it. There's our RDA showing it's an RDA record. Actually, OCLC quality control did some work on here. They may have done some reformatting or something like that. There's our ISSN. Let's see, some other things. We got our call number, all that other stuff. We have these fields down here that we're about to look at in just a minute, the 210 and the 222. These are supplied by ISSN organizations, and we're going to talk just a tiny bit about these fields. Then we have our title field down in the 245. We have a parallel title in the 246, and you see here that this is just spelling out. So we have Nat Geo Wild, and now somebody put a 246 in for National Geographic Wild, so that if people are looking for National Geographic versus Nat Geo, people would still find it. They spelled out the word Wild Magazine, so they put another one in. And then we have information with the publisher. We have some frequency here. This is print, text, and mediated volume. We have information here about the publishing range. So it began with volume 1 and it ended with volume 1, number 2. This was fairly short-lived, wasn't it? And the other thing you can see here is that it actually ended with number 2, December 2016, January 2017. So this one ended with a volume that covered 2 years. So what would you do? You would use the latest year, which is 2017. So they followed exactly what they needed to do. Of course, we would expect that from them. So we have other things. We have some notes down here, 500 field. You know, people put all kinds of notes in records, and I am such a fan of notes. So add notes as you need them, in my opinion. 588, and we're going to talk about both of these, sort of these two 588 fields in a minute, but CONSERT does require that there's a 588 for description based upon or based on, and then there's another one about latest issue consulted. So they do have that as a requirement, and we're going to talk more about those two fields in a minute. Then we see our subject headings here. One thing you'll notice about serial subject headings is they have a tendency to be very general. You know, this is very general. Animals. I mean, that's it. Not any kind of animals, just animals. But you'll notice the subfield V for periodicals. So that is something to, you know, really think about when you are looking, especially copy catalogers, you know, thinking about the subject headings. You may not need to check the subject headings or even verify them, but it may be something you want to take a look at as those form subdivisions, because there's not too many of them that really apply to serials, but periodicals is probably one of the most common ones you'll see. Sometimes you'll see fast headings, and that's fine. I would say leave them if you can, if it's not going to cause a problem. The one thing I can say about this is that they should have closed this one out. And by closing that out, I mean, they should have added the end date of it, that this finished in 2017. So, you know, the fact that somebody kind of completed the work here and they added the 217 here, but they did not add the 217 here, or they could have just even done a dot and left it as 216 because, you know, in theory it's 216, 217, but I would have added a 217 and closed it out. And closing it out means that if the serial or periodical newspaper, whatever it is, has ended, you are adding the ending date to the 264 and you are adding the ending date up here. That's really what closing the record out means, is that people can see that that record has ended. Now, it's possible that you may want to put some other information down here about that ending. But just having the date closed here and the date closed up here tells someone that it is done. You know, that those dates have ended. So which issue to use for cataloging? You have a choice. First issue, classic RDA. And then if issues are numbered, you're going to choose the lowest issue. If they're unnumbered, you're going to choose the earliest date. And then CONSERT is latest what you have on hand. So where do we find information? So that's the first choice you need to make as far as original cataloging, which one of those you're going to do. But once you get to that, then where do you find information for print serial, at least? We're going to talk about both print and electronic here. So for print, you're going, first choice is always going to be kind of your title page or cover, depending on what if you're looking at more of a newspaper or magazine, you're going to be looking more at what that front page would look like. If there's no title page, no front page kind of thing for a newspaper or magazine, no cover kind of thing, then you're going to look at sort of a hierarchy of choices. So it could be a cover or jacket. We don't really have jackets too much with serials. Sometimes you do. Some serials will have a cover and a title page. So if there's a title page first, you're always going to prefer the title page. If there's not a title page, and many serials do not. So I would say like academic journals and things like that would be more likely to have a title page on the inside. Certainly magazines, newspapers, things like that are going to be very unlikely to have a title page on the inside. They're going to have a cover, and then there may be that subscription page that we looked at last week. So that would be for a magazine, especially in newspaper, but newspapers are a little harder to find that. But for a magazine, especially, you're going to look for that serial subscription page. So title page, if there is one. And for serials, do not stress if you can't find one, because lots of serials do not have a title page. Otherwise, then you're going to go right down the list: cover, caption, masthead. Masthead's really what you would see more for a newspaper with that big, Kilo Times or whatever on it. If there's still no title, you can really look at any other resource with any other source within that resource, and that's where you get to like that subscription page. So if you can't really find a title anywhere else, there should be some subscription information on that serial somewhere, and that would be hopefully some information about the title there as well. To subscribe to Painters Quarterly, and then it's going to give you information about subscribing to it, but at least you have the title to start with. Where to find information for non-print? If you have page images, so let's say you have an electronic journal or you have an electronic magazine and it looks like a magazine or it looks like a journal. If there are sort of images of what looks a representation of what looks for a page, then you're going to follow the print. So you're going to look just at all those places we just talked about. So just because it's electronic doesn't mean that you're going to look someplace else if it still looks like a print thing. And this goes for ebooks too. So I know we're not really talking about ebooks, so that's monographs. We're not really talking about that in this class, but it's the same sort of thing. You're going to be looking for that representation of the print thing. And so you're going, if it looks like a print book, or it's a PDF but looks like a print book, same thing. If it looks like a print serial, if it looks like a print magazine, you're going to follow exactly what we just talked about. So if there are page images, you're going to follow print. If there's not page images, and this is an example of a CD, but you're really going to look at what resource you have. So if you have something on a DVD, or you would happen to have something on some other kind of format, then you're going to look at things like, you're going to look at the print or label on whatever resource you have. You're going to look at the content that present a title. So this may be then where you start thinking about like the website kind of thing. Looking at a website, you're trying to figure out where it might be. There's not a lot of websites are really going to be more into integrating resources, but this information also applies for integrating resources. So, you're going to look for labels on the resource itself. Of course, for an integrating resource, you're looking at a website. So then you're going to be looking at textual content that present a title. So anything that's going to tell you what it is. And if you have something that's a physical item, then you're going to look at the container or accompanying material issued with the resource. So for a serial that might be on a DVD. You're going to look at the printing or label. You're going to look at the textual content, and then you're going to look at any material that you may get with that resource. So that could even be material coming from the publisher or really any source of information you have. Typically, you're not going to have to do this for an e-serial, unless maybe it's a database or something like that. Typically, the information is going to be presented fairly straightforward. And I would say for most of us, and you're not going to use square brackets in terms of creating the title for these. You're just going to take it from what it is. So that comes along to then transcription. And transcription is something that's part of RDA, and this impacts certain fields that we have. For serials, this can be numbering, and this would fall really on the more of the series category than anything else. So we'll talk more about talk a little bit more about numbering as we go along, but it's probably really going to impact more of the series fields in the 490 and 830, or titles if you would need to put the number in a title for some reason. So if you need to do that, and like I said, this is really going to apply more to series, and said we touch on series a couple of times, but for numbering, you're going to record numerals as they appear, but you're going to record words as numbering as numerals. So what that would mean if you had the word for, F-O-U-R, you're just going to turn that into a number. So that's essentially what that kind of word gobbledygook means. For any serials or series numbering, the term is the part that's transcribed, so that comes directly from the resource, and the number part is recorded. And so here's a quick example of this. So you have on our issue, we would have a volume 1, number 1, and we would record that as volume 1. So we just record that as it is, or volume I, we'd record it as it is, and then number, we're just going to record that as number then. So we're just going to, the term is going to be transcribed exactly as it is, and then the number you're just going to record as the number. We have sexto tomo, which is 6, and I don't know exactly the degree part of it, but apparently that's part of how that would be translated. And then tomo, we just record that exactly as it appears. So transcription fields, mention these just a little bit there as we sort of waded into that. Description fields, primarily it's the 245, 250, and 264. And this is where you're going to transcribe it as it appears on the piece or use a style guide. This would be capitalization guide. This includes abbreviations and punctuations. So you're going to include abbreviations and punctuations in these fields exactly as they appear on your resource, except where punctuation separates those elements. And I'll point that out next time we get to an example and look at it. Diacritical marks, you don't add them if they're not present. So again, we're transcribing titles as they appear on a resource. There may be times when you need to add a diacritic, maybe the publisher, especially for older print material, sometimes they couldn't publish, they couldn't print the diacritics. So you may need to, kind of add that in. When you're doing things, there occasionally there'll be diacritics missing, especially when you're looking at copy cataloging. There may be diacritics that are missing when you're looking at a particular title, so you may need to add those in. But they should, if it's an RDA record, we've already looked at what makes an RDA record. If it's an RDA record, it should be transcribed. The 250 is an addition statement, and this is a transcribe it as it appears on your resource. There are not as many addition statements with serials as there are other types, especially monographs, other types of resources. I would say there are some you will occasionally see like revised or, something like that. But we just have a tendency with serials, they don't have as much of a tendency to like make a new edition or revise it or anything. They just kind of like change it and keep going. So there is a little bit more of that fluid nature to it, as opposed to, monograph where you print, I'm going to make the 2001 project manager's guide. And then I'm going to, a few years later, I'm going to make the 2021 project manager's guide. And, I'm going to take what I did back then, I'm going to revise it. But it's, it's separate works published at different times. The only relationship to each other is it's the same person. I've just taken the work and revised it, but they're both single static works. And, monographs had a tendency to do that much more. Whereas if I was doing the, project managers weekly, I would just kind of change my topic and maybe change the layout. And I might even call it project managers weekly new or something. I might even give it some other name or something like that to kind of make it kind of stand out a little bit or something. But I'm not really going to, it's not going to be something that's going to be kind of a separate thing that gets published in that way. There are a few serials that have additions, but I would say it's fairly unusual. So let's dive back into MARC fields. We kind of talked about some of the things we need to know as we go along. Sort of that top half is the variable fields, the 0XX fields, and XX just means the range from 0 to 99. So in this case, when we're talking about sort of the top half of those fields there. So in this case, we have, there's the 022, which is our ISSN. There's our 042 telling us a little bit about that institution and their program for cooperative cataloging there in the PCC. And then, of course, we have our LC call number. Again, we're not going to be talking too much about LC call numbers in this class because this isn't a classification class, but I will try to kind of point out things as we go along. One thing you'll notice about serials call numbers is that they don't typically have a year in the call number. And why is that? Because a serial call number covers many years. So it's not going to be typically just 1 year. So typically, if you have a serial call number, it's going to be, for one, it's going to be more general because it's going to be like that animals periodicals where it's just like, something that's a very general topic. And so a lot of times serials will kind of sit at the beginning of a subject because it's going to be right there. It's going to be right there with that call number that's very general that puts it in that category sort of right up front. Sometimes periodicals, especially sort of contemporary magazines and things like that, they'll be in their own area so that people can kind of read through them and look at them and things like that. So they may even be in their own area and may even be shelved by like title and stuff like that. So there's lots more that happen with serials besides, just giving them a call number. They go so much more than that. If you are doing original cataloging, then you can record if you find a valid ISSN, that is the International Serial Standard Number. If you find that, then you can put that into an 022 field. And then if you find an older one, or maybe what would even be an invalid ISSN. So if you would happen to find like a former title that's related to this, you could always put it in the subfield Y. You don't see a whole lot of that going on with serials, but it does occasionally happen. So subfield A of the 022 is going to be the ISSN that matches your current title. 1XX fields and 7XX fields. There's not a ton of these in serial records, but you will occasionally, especially a 110 field, which would be for an organization or a corporate body. You will sometimes occasionally see a 100 field, which would be a personal name. You're more likely to see a 110, like I said, that would be an organization or corporate body. You don't see them very often though. But if you have that statement of responsibility in a subfield C, so if you have people listed, and remember, this is for the whole serial run in that title. So it's not just the person who edited volume 10, it's everybody, it'd be that whole entire work. And since it's that whole work, a lot of times nothing gets put in for the statement of responsibility because, you know, there'll be somebody who edited volume 1 and then somebody else edited volume 10, and then we don't know who's going to edit volume 15 yet, and it's still going on. So in that case, we just put nobody, or we might put the organization. Like if we know the University of Florida chemistry department creates this magazine, and, you know, chemistry magazine, and they're involved in it and all the different faculty are involved in it, then we might list the University of Florida chemistry department possibly in that subfield C as, you know, sort of the people associated with it. We'd be more likely to list them as in the 264 as a publisher, and then we might list it as a 710 and call them an issuing body. So that would be more likely what we would see. But we don't see a whole lot of subfield C. So that would be like, you know, who authored it, who edited, that kind of thing, because it has to apply to the serial as a whole. But if you have a statement of responsibility, if you have a subfield C in a 245, so that's in your title field, then you do need to consider what you're going to do with those names. Are you going to give them if it's a person, are you going to give him or her a 100 field, or are you going to put them in a 7XX field? So you put them in a 700 field. And this impacts your MARC formatting, and it also then can impact like how your whole thing is searched and stuff like that. So if the most sort of the bottom line of it is, if you have a 1XX field, so if you have a field, a 110, a 100 field, a 111 field in a serial record or in any MARC record, it's not just serials, but in any MARC record, then your 245 first indicator is 1. Without it, it is 0. So that's just a straight up MARC thing. And this is true for all bibliographic MARC records. And for you know, for those of you who are cataloging, I mean, this is something for those of you copy cataloging, this is something you could definitely check and you know, kind of take a look at too, to see whether or not you need to fix it, because it is something that occasionally gets missed. So if you have any of the 1XX, so if you have a 100 field, a 110 field, and in your 240, then your 245 first indicator should be 1, and second indicator then would be whatever the title, and we're going to talk about those in a second. But without it, if you don't have a 100, 110, 111 field, then it's going to be a 0. So serials, we don't see that a lot of. If you have a 1XX field, that will also typically impact your LC call number. That's something to consider too. Just to remember, just as a reminder, if you are looking at any of these records where you're seeing that it's a cooperative cataloging program that created the record, or if it's that bibliographic agency, then in theory, and really in any CONSER record, these authorities should have been reviewed and checked. So in theory, if you're copy cataloging, you shouldn't have to review or check any of the authority things. So let's look at some title examples. We kind of talked all about stuff. Let's get back to actually looking at some examples. So here we have what's called the key title. And the key title is a shortened title, and it comes from the ISS institution or the ISS body. So as the ISS is created, they give it a shortened title. So that's something that not typically when you're original cataloging, you're not going to necessarily know that unless you see that information someplace. So then we have the 222, and again, that's coming from that's again another one of those fields that's coming from the ISSN body or organization. And then the 245 is kind of where we would kind of come into it, right? 245, the Yachting Monthly, and there is our 0 because of course we don't, well, I've kind of truncated it here, but we don't have a 1 up here. So, you know, it's just a 0. And then we have 4 for our second indicator, and that's just counting over to where the word that we first want the search starts. So we don't want to search any articles. We don't want to search for the, because I mean, that's just not very helpful, right? You know, we would want to start our search process. We would want to say the title starts with yachting, because that's sort of the important keyword. So any initial articles we're going to skip past with that indexing indicator. And then we gave it a 246 because at one point it was called yachting. And in our little example over here, we see this one actually just says yacht. So we would probably, if this belonged on this record with all these others, then we'd want to add another 246 that just said yacht, because that's kind of what our little example says here. Another example here, we have research and industrial organization. And then we have a note that we have issues that came after 2013, and they said research in industrial organization. So we have a little bit of a sort of verification in terms of what things say. And do you notice what the change is here? Well, they had research and industrial organization with organization spelled with an S. And then starting in 2013, they decided that they would change it to the more Americanized version of organization with the Z. So you can see this is one of those things where it's not, if everything else fits with this record, that this is not really anything major. They just have corrected sort of a variation in title spelling. So this is not something, provided everything else about the record kind of gels. They have not changed anything enough that would really make us want to put it on a separate record. We would just want to add some kind of note that, you know, starting in 2013, they changed how they spelled organization. And that's all we really need to do. So the 210, I talked a little bit about this already. This is the title of an item that is abbreviated. This really has to do with indexing and identification, and it comes from the ISSN centers, and they base it on the 222. So these two fields, the 210 and the 222 fields, are coming from the ISSN centers. So they're coming from those fields. Some other abbreviated titles are supplied by cataloging agencies, including abstracting and indexing services. You know, it's not usually one of the, basically it's one of those things, if we have that information available to us on a record, great. Otherwise, you know, it's just not there. For original cataloging, we probably don't know this anyway, so we wouldn't be able to put in a 210 or 222. We might need to take a look at those fields and kind of do some research to see if we could find that information in some of the documentation. We could go look up the ISSN associated, look up the ISSN in the ISSN documentation and see if we could find that information. So if we're doing original cataloging, we'd need to do a little more work to see if we need to add that information. Copy catalogers, you can ignore it or review it. And if you're original cataloging, you're not doing concert work, you can just not worry about that. It really depends upon how much you would need to include. So for each mark field, I've really put in as much information as I can. So I'm not going to go through all of this for, at least for these two fields, because in general, you're not going to be adding these fields and you're not really going to need to do anything with these fields, but just kind of know what they are. So you have this information. Everything came out of bibliographics, formats, and standards. We have some examples here, but we're just going to kind of skate by these because we still have a lot of fields to cover. Let's see if there's anything else I want to talk to you about these. They are unique. So these are assigned by national centers that also assign the ISSN and the key titles, and they are unique. Yeah, if you're original cataloging and you see something, so if for some reason you come across it and you find that information on your resource, you can certainly put it into the record. If you are creating a record for a microfilm or photocopy reproduction, so you sort of have the original record for the original or for the microfilm, whatever you are doing, then you can actually take that ISN and the keynote from the record from the original, and you can add that into your reproduction record. If copy cataloging, you just take a look at it and not worry too much about it. You don't have to spend a whole lot of time on it. 245, we already talked about the 0 and 1 for the indicators. We talked a little bit about the non-filing characters, so that's how far to count over. Common subfields, subfield A, that's title. Subfield N is number of part or section of work, and then P is the name of the part or section of work. And then less likely, so you're less likely to encounter for serials, a subfield B, which is a remainder of the title. And you're less, we already talked about this one, but you're less likely to encounter that statement of responsibility. But if you have one, you're going to transcribe it and you're going to add your appropriate fields, as we already talked about. There's others for the 245, of course, because there's all those 245 subfields that are used for monographs. So, you know, the 245 field is used across all different kinds of records. And in fact, it's one of the few fields in OCLC that's actually required to be in a record. So the 245 is used across all different kinds of formats. So there's a lot more subdivisions there besides what I've listed, but I kind of picked the 3 you're most likely to encounter. And in all honesty, cataloging serials, you're most likely to see the title, and you will, to a lesser extent, see the subfield N and P. It really depends upon how big your library is, and I would say whether or not you select a lot of scholarly academic journals and things like that where you might encounter numbers and parts. Numbers and parts are going to be more likely when you have something that's like a sub-series or, you know, part of something else. So you may, I do know there are some serials that are part of, that do have numbers and parts, but it's not very common to see that for a serial record. And certainly for like magazines and newspapers and stuff, you're probably not going to see that at all. We already looked at these title examples, so we'll just kind of skip by those. I thought I might have more to say. 245, transcription field. We already talked about counting over for that second indicator. So I've given you the example there for the newsletter. You would count THE space, and then you would start with the word newsletter. So that would be four spaces over to start with the word newsletter. For original cataloging for serials, we're not transcribing introductory words, and that was things like Disney Presents, things like that. It's not always easy to tell if it's an introductory word. So, you know, if you're not sure, you're just going to transcribe it. And I would say that's true for copy cataloging too. If you see a record and maybe yours has something like CNN Presents on it, or Disney Presents, or whatever it may be, or introducing, or some words like that, and that is the only thing that's missing, like everything else matches the record, and the dates seem good and everything seems like it fits in that record, then it just may be an example of this where those introductory words aren't being transcribed. So if you are copy cataloging, you're definitely going to want to look at the 245 field, and you're going to want to, you know, double check that and make sure it matches. And also, you know, keep an eye out for like this introductory word kind of thing where you may have that mismatch where they may include it and it's not on your piece, or they may omit it and you do have it on yours. This is just sort of some of these little granular kind of details of things that catalogers decide they want to drive people nutty with. But if numbering starts or chronological designation starts the title, we apply what's called a mark of omission, which is the little ellipses, the 3 dots. So you wouldn't start a title with 1999, you would just start it with the 3 dots. So you might see that. So if you had, let's say you had a, you know, had a newsletter that's had 2010 newsletter, This is going to be a really hard record to verify, right? Because you have something that's very general in terms of the title. So you're really going to have to look at all those different aspects of it and look at the publisher and see if you can find the ISSN and all that kind of stuff to try to figure out which record it goes on. No titles. If there's no title in the serial, you're going to record one enclosed in square brackets. And there's sort of a whole list of kind of what you're going to record. If there's no title at all, so if there's no title in the serial, but you can find it elsewhere, and this can even be like going to the publisher's website. So for those of you original cataloging, once you wander away from your resource, you can find information all over the place about some of these resources. So you can use any available resource, but make sure you add a note to kind of explain where that came from. So that becomes very, very important for serials because of the different ways they can be cataloged with the latest entry and the sort of earliest entry. If there's no title at all from any available resource, and this may really occur, honestly, I think it occurs most if you have something that's an independent press, or maybe you have something that maybe it's missing. I've cataloged stuff where it's like things are missing, like the title page and the last page and kinds of stuff. Anyway, you're missing information, or maybe it's something really old, so there's just didn't give it a title. There's no title at all, then you can construct one in English. And you really should look at how you're going to kind of come up with like words that describe like the nature or content of the serial. And I'm thinking about these little like zines and newsletters and things like that, that especially like small, like, photocopy stuff that people used to do and stuff like that. And if you're collecting that kind of stuff, you're probably doing this a lot already. But if you do need to construct a title, then do make sure that you kind of give some indication about where the title came from. And I would say the same thing too if you're going outside the resource. If you have to go to the publisher's website to get the title of that resource, please, for the copy catalogers who will be looking at that record, by every kindness in your heart, please put something on there to explain to people where that information came from, because otherwise they're left with a title and they don't have a title, or maybe they got one of those things that actually has a title on it and they're having a very hard time finding a record. And to see that information there can really be the thing that tells them that it's okay to take that record. It's okay to accept it. So please do your good deed always. So let's look at another example. I'm going to try to go through fields and talk about them, and then we're going to skip back in and actually look at real examples and kind of keep doing that in the tag team. Let's see, we talked about institutions. I think we've talked about ISNs. There's an example language again, PCC. Let's see, there's our call number. Notice no date on that call number. There's our 210 and 222s. Our abbreviate title, key title, those are by the ISSN organization. This one is missing a 310 field for frequency, so that's something that we could add in. And it could be they didn't know what the frequency was. So, I mean, it's not unlikely. This started in 2018, so maybe they cataloged the first one and they just had no idea what the frequency was going to be yet. So, but if you can determine what the frequency is, or maybe if you were, maybe if you're a person who can enhance or upgrade records or do that kind of work in OCLC, then you might add a 310 if you could determine what that is. Because you see up here, the frequency is blank and they didn't know how regular it was or couldn't determine that yet. And they just did not know really enough to be able to fill out that information. So that's one reason why you see multiple institutions sometimes listed for serials, is because one institution, I mean, if you have volume 1 and you're cataloging from volume 1, then that's your latest issue. I mean, if it just came out and you've got the first thing and you're cataloging it, then you're cataloging from latest issue because you've got the first one. And you may not know at the time you're cataloging it things like frequency or how often it's going to come out. And it's better just to leave that blank than guess. So, but, you know, we're 3 years after that, and maybe we have a better sense now of how regular this is going to be. If it's coming out 4 times a year and it's quarterly, and we know sort of what the pattern is for publication, then we could go ahead and fill out the frequency and regularity if we had permission to be able to do that work. So, you know, that's why sometimes when you see records and you think like, well, why is it missing that? It's like, well, but if they catalog the first volume, they're just not going to know that. And it's very possible that that's what happened. Again, we have, this is print, so there's our text and mediated and volume. So what do you do with title inaccuracies? This is the opposite of monographs, and I'll explain why it's the opposite of monographs in a minute. So the title on the title page 245, the title on the title page is Breakfast at the Red Brick House. You like my example? I've been using it for a while. Breakfast at the Red Brick House. So that's what it said on the title page of that book. And 245 is a description field. So we would record it as it appears on the resource. And then because we can't stand to see a typo in our catalog, and because the publisher might actually fix it somewhere along the way, and another printing, we're going to go ahead and add a 246 for Breakfast at the Red Brick House. And I know this pains some of us to have a typo in our catalog, but there's a reason, because that is what appears on the resource for that one. But for serials, it's a bit different, because remember, serials covers the whole thing. So we have one issue for 1999, and it has a typo in it. So the issue for 1999 has the title of Directory of World Environmental Organizations. And of course, it's supposed to be Directory of World Organizations. So we're going to kind of flip that a little bit. We're going to keep our title as it's supposed to be. And we're just going to add a 246 for the one that's incorrect. So if you were copy cataloging this and you saw Directory of World Environmental Organizations, and then yours said world, then you could add a 246 and just note which issue was misspelled. Now, if you notice that all of the issues you were getting were misspelled, then that might make you think they've actually changed the title, or they made such a boo-boo they've changed the title. But that's something you're going to have to investigate. But if it's just an issue, or one issue, or even an issue in here and there, you know, maybe they've used the wrong template and just sometimes it just gets out misspelled, whatever it may be, then you're just going to record the 246 for whichever's incorrect. And you can have multiple 246s. You would not want every issue to have, you know, issue for this title has something different. If you have that, then you really need to take a look at that. That's going to be the situation. You're also going to use a title, a 246, for titles that begin with symbols. So much as we did back here with our, we were talking about doing our ellipses for our 4 years. For one with a symbol, we can go ahead and put the symbol in, but then we're going to add a 246 for the symbol. So 246 variant forms of the title. I've given you some examples here of what it might look like with 246s and 245s, so you can kind of see what they both look like. A lot of times when you have acronyms, or you have things that have like punctuation in them, like this example here, we'll record them both with and without the punctuation. You'll notice the 246 has no punctuation at the end, and the 245 does. So that's like a punctuation difference thingy. And I have 245 here that needs punctuation. Anyway, so there is some kind of things to consider. Now, if I knew what BTSB is, and again, it's probably not K-pop, but if I knew what BTSB was, then I might go ahead and just do another 246 and say report on the backtrack something, whatever that would be, whatever it might be. I have no idea what BTSB might be. But if I actually knew what that was, or it appeared on my resource someplace, I would go ahead and record that out too. We will talk more about title changes in the upcoming weeks. You remember I was talking about like that difference between organization when they change the spelling. Here's another one where it's like the title varies and there's like a little bit of variation from how the title's done. So we have the New Zealand Port and Telegraph Officers Advocate, and especially with older stuff, you get a lot of this kind of stuff. 1891, there was a title variant, New Zealand Post and Telegraph Gazette. And then it kind of, changed it a little bit. And then it was the New Zealand Post Office and Telegraph Service. Then it was the New Zealand Post Office and Telegraph Officers Advocate. So it kind of has a little bit of a history. So these may be things that we'd have to just kind of take a little bit of a look at too. 246, I'm not going to go into all these, but you'll just have these to kind of look at. I kind of picked out the things that are more common that you would see in this field. And I would say usually going to see more of like the 246.1 for the parallel title. Sometimes you see a 246.3, you'll see that. So, and then whether or not an added entry or what you're going to do for the first indicator. The most common use you're going to see for that first indicator is a 246.1. That's sort of the preferred version. And then there's also a 246.3, which is no note added entry. And this is really what you would use for alternate titles, parallel titles, parts of the title proper, typo correction acronyms. So although one's preferred for a lot of the situations we most commonly probably encounter, we're probably going to encounter the threes mostly. I mean, realistically, I know that like one's the preferred choice, but then it's like when you look at the examples, it's like, well, but threes, really probably what we mostly are going to do. Parallel titles, typo, acronyms, alternate titles. So, like I said, one is technically preferred, but three is sort of it. So dates of publication, we're moving on to the 264 dates of publication, distribution, manufacture, transcription. Again, describe the data as it appears. Only the first place is required for recording. So you only list the first place in a list. Only the first publisher listed is required for recording. That's concert standards. RDA says you can record all of them. I would say most catalogers do not record all of them. I'll just be honest. Although RDA says a lot of things that you could do that makes a lot more data, and I think catalogers still have a tendency to try to simplify it a little bit. So, if you have a long list of publishers or a long list of publishing locations where it's like Miami, New York, Seattle, a lot of people would just put in Miami, and they're not going to go all the way down the list. Because it does make more work, and I think it does make it a little bit harder to parse out the data sometimes by putting them all in. Conser for serial records to that level says that you only the first place listed is required, and only the first publisher listed is required. If copy cataloging, you're just going to try to verify it as much as you can. If the information is not on the resource, you're going to supply a probable date. Rather than giving a place of distribution or manufacture. And this is becoming more true for monographs too, where it's like you're trying to supply a date if you can. If you're recording publisher not identified, then give the name of the distributor or name of manufacturer in that order if you can. So you're really just trying to get as much publication information in as you can. And so you may see stuff like this. You can use brackets to supply information, or if you feel certain about it, if you feel that you have a good sense of where it is, then you can just go ahead and you don't need to put in brackets. So for example, if I know that the U.S. Department of Agriculture Natural National Agriculture Library is at Beltsville, Maryland, I don't really have to bracket them because I know that's where it is. If they have multiple locations and if there's also one in Washington, D.C., then but I think it's the one in Beltsville because that seems like that's where the publishing happens, then I would go ahead and put it in brackets if I wasn't sure. So you can do that sort of information. Serials can be a little bit different. Here's a serials example down here at the bottom. And they can be a little bit different in terms of how they record information. A lot of times they'll record sort of the date in the beginning, and we'll talk a little bit more of that as we look at those records. You don't see this as much now as you kind of did in the early days of RDA, but you may see that in a earlier RDA serial record, and it's okay as a copy cataloger if you see that. I'm not going to really talk about all the different pieces of the 264, but what I do want to point out is different from Monographs cataloging. Monographs cataloging, we almost always use a 264 first indicator's nothing. We just blanket nothing in that first indicator. Serials, this is where you're going to see a 2 or a 3. So this is going to be something you're going to see more of with serials cataloging for copy catalogers that if you've been cataloging a lot of monographs, you're going to notice that as a difference. If you are cataloging serials, then you should take a look at that because it has to do with what, where your item is in terms of that resource. Is it the current or latest? And if so, you're going to use a 3. Or is it one of the intervening ones and then you're going to use a 2? So here's some examples of that. 264, again, we're kind of supplying some information there. We weren't sure of the location. We weren't sure of exactly who published Yachting Monthly, so we just kind of guessed it was Yachting Monthly. And we know it started in 1920 and we know it's continuing on. So that's a fairly straightforward one. And that is using that publication information. Feast title, we have Atlanta, Georgia. Again, this is using just for publication information. Press club, and then we have the dates supplied in brackets because we kind of know when they are going to be, but we don't exactly know. We do use those second indicators of 2 and 3, but you don't always see them used as much as they should. And sometimes people just don't know. If I have the whole range here, if I have 2001 to 2009, or I know that that's kind of the range of things, then, I don't really have an intervening or current because it's kind of done. So it's just fine to just use one for that. 300 field, the indicators are blank for both. The first subfield A is the unit where we talk about our unit of measurement and the term for that measure, our term for the extent and that unit for extent. And then B is our illustrations, and then C is the dimensions, typically in centimeters. For media, it's not in centimeters always. Sometimes it can be inches, but for most print, well, for print, it's going to be centimeters. Centimeters is a unit of measurement, and so units of measurement are abbreviated, and that's contrary to other RDA guidance in terms of abbreviations. So if you just remember units of measurement are abbreviated, that kind of solves that, whether or not you need to write out the word or not. So unit and term, if known, if the serial is not complete, the unit or extent of the resource is not required, only the term. So you would just say volumes. You don't need to say 9 volumes because what? You don't know 9 volumes, right? You don't know how many volumes there's going to be. And you may not know. Certainly if you have newspaper issues, I mean, are you really going to know that there's 385 newspaper issues? You probably don't, or you may not want to go count or anything else. So volumes a lot of times is all you're going to see for serials for that particular part of it. A lot of times you do not see measurements for serials, and certainly illustrations are kind of a mixed bag because it really depends upon the nature of the serial as a whole. So, if you just have a cover image, that's not really that's not really an illustration the way we think of illustrated content. It needs to be a little bit more than that. These do relate to the 336, 337, and 338 fields. And we're going to kind of skate through those in a minute. Dimensions are not required by Conserve for e-resources or print serials. So you probably won't see anything about the size. And that kind of makes a lot of sense because, of course, serials can kind of vary a little bit with size, especially depending upon that particular publication. And think about newspapers, like some issues of a newspaper are really thick. Other issues are, like the Sunday paper is really big and the Monday paper is really little. There's the same kind of thing where you just don't worry about dimensions so much for serials. Once you actually have serials that are bound and are sitting on a shelf, then sometimes you will see that information that's filled out a little bit. If copy cataloging, you're just going to verify what you can here. 336, 337, 338, content type 336, media type 337, carrier type. Oh gosh, sorry, I got to fix that. 338 for carrier type. So I will upload new slides. 338 for carrier type. Content type, this is where you're going to talk about really what it is. So, is it text? Is it a computer resource? That kind of thing. Then you're going to talk about 337. Do you need a device to access this? Unmediated means you need no device. It needs no mediation to access it. And I know we can talk the term forever, but that's how we're applying it. Computer, of course, do you need a computer to access it? This would be where you get to an e-resource. And then for carrier, what is the actual container like? And examples of that would be volume for print. So I need to update that slide now. Frequency, current frequency is required if known. So we talked about the if known aspect earlier. Former frequency is not required on original records for Conserve. So that's 310 and 321. So 310 is only required if it's known. 310 indicators are both blank. 0 is your current publication frequency. Subfield B is the date of publication frequency. And then A is really going to be the most commonly used for that. 321 indicators are both blank. A is former publication frequency. B is the date of it. Again, subfield A is going to be the most commonly used. So here's some examples. You're going to capitalize the first letter of the first word in the subfield A. You're going to spell out, they just try to make it look a little bit better. You're going to spell out if it's a number. So you're going to spell that out. And if there are multiple former frequencies, so if frequency has changed, like how often it's been published changes a lot, then every time there's a frequency change in the past, you're going to document that in the 321. So this may be something that copy catalogers certainly it's helpful to see. This may be something that you consider changing, is that if you have a frequency change, but everything else is the same, then you might think about updating the 310 to be what the frequency is now, how it's issued now, and then you may want to, update the 321 or add a 321 as needed to explain how that frequency has changed. 362, dates of publication and or sequential designation. First indicator is the format of the date, and then there's a formatted style or an unformatted note. These are really the dates that identify individual issues of a serial. General publication dates, so publication dates for the whole serial are put in the 264 and then up in the dates field. And then this would be something that would be related to specific issues. You're not going to use a 362 for incomplete serial dates. You're going to record uncertain dates or numbers in an unformatted note, so you can put a question mark if you're not sure. So, as opposed to a 362 with the first indicator 1, if you have an incomplete serial date, you don't know what the dates are, you're not sure of the dates, then you can put the information in with a question mark. Only repeat when one of the fields has a first indicator value of 0 and the other one's a 1. So you're not going to repeat the 362 using the same indicators. If the only way you can have two 362s if you have one that's a 1 and one that's a 0. A concert requirement for recording is that you're going to use the numeric or alphabetic designation of the first issue, if known, the chronological designation of the first issue, if known. So you're going to kind of use what you have, if known. So that's sort of what you're going to use is kind of what's the first and then what's the last, if known. And that's sort of the bigger question. So what does it actually look like? Because there's a lot of like, if known, and what do you do? Like, how do you record this information? So remember, 0 is a styled note. So that's going to follow specific instructions that we just looked at there. And then 1's kind of a note where you can say whatever you want to say about it, right? So, and there's some guidance there about sort of what you say, but so here's a 362.1, and we're just saying like it began with this volume. Like it's not ended yet, so we have no information on ending, but we know when it began, so we're going to go ahead and record that information. Or here's an example of one that ended where we know when it ends. So we have volume, the first one, we're just going to list the volume number when it began, and then we're going to explain a little bit about when it ended. So the 362 is meant to explain when something started, and if it has ended, when it would end. So in addition to closing out the dates at the top in the fixed field and closing out the dates in our 264, the other thing that we might want to do is add 362s. Now this is required for a concert record. It's not required for other records. So this may be one of those places where the information would be really helpful to someone copy cataloging, trying to figure out, does my thing fit on here? Does it fit within this date range? But it's not always going to be in those records because it's not a requirement. Other situations, we talked about the statement of responsibility in the subfield C already, and this really isn't going to be common in serials, and it's not a concert standard. So the other thing you can do with that information is you can put it in a 550 field, which is called issuing body. You can put it there. If you want to include that information in somewhere, do you remember subfield C is transcription? We already talked about, sort of adding your headings and things like that if you need to. So let's look at some more examples. We're looking down here, so we're skipping down to look at our publishing information. We have 2017 there. If we look up at our dates field, we have 2017 there. Here's our frequency. So we have a 310 field with our frequency. And if we look up here, we have a frequency in the fixed field. And let's see, what else do I want to talk about? Well, and it's print because it's text, unmediated, and volume. So, this is a fairly straightforward serial record, but we've got a little bit of information about frequency. So if I needed to create check-in records, or if I was wondering, like, should we be getting more of these? Gosh, I thought we were supposed to get more Colorado politics, and our subscription says it's up to date. Should we be getting more of these? Then you may also check the serials record in OCLC or whatever way you can get to a serial record and see if it has a frequency, because that can be helpful too in terms of like, oh, look, it says it's weekly, or, oh my gosh, it says it's ceased. Well, I guess we should talk to the publisher about why are we being charged for this? So we're moving on down that record. There's our 362. So that's getting to kind of when it started. We think it started with this particular title. We think it started 2017. So we kind of put that date like, did it start 2017? And you see there, we've used that 2017. So 2017 for our start date, 2017 for our date in our 264 field. And then we have 2017 as our possible beginning date. Now, the next two fields, and we're going to talk about these kind of as we go along, but I just want to point out those 588 fields. Those 588 fields we have there, we have 2 fields there, one for description based on and one latest issue consulted. And I've got some weird formatting there that seems to have led through from the other slide. I will double check on it. So other situations, you may occasionally encounter a serial that is part of a series or part of something else. If so, you're going to kind of take a look at what we talked about in class 1 for a recording series as 49830s. If copy cataloging, you encounter this situation, you may choose to ignore it, or you may continue to explore it and kind of figure out what you might need to do. URLs can be recorded in an 856, and but they should be accessible to all, not a link that is paywalled. And we're going to talk about this in the upcoming weeks. This is actually called a provider neutral philosophy. And when we are originally cataloging for something that we purchase that's available electronically, we are not going to put in information about our vendor. We're not going to put in information about, we're not going to put in our individual URL because we want it to be a record that would apply for everyone. If we're going to put it into OCLC for everybody else to share, then the information in that record for the electronic resource should be something that everybody can use. I know that's not always possible, but we'll talk, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in the future, about like sort of that whole electronic resources and that piece of it. But I just wanted to mention the 856 because that's a thing you'll see in serials records sometimes. Language can be recorded in a variety of places. We've already talked about some of these. It can be recorded up in that fixed field area. It can be recorded in the 041, and it can also be recorded in that alphabetic field, depending on what kind of script it is. And then, of course, it can be recorded in a 546 too. So 546 also. So 546 is what language it's commonly written in. If it's in more than one script, you can subfield B and kind of add both of them together. So you can kind of chain together as many of these as you need. So 1546 talking about all the languages. Now remember this, for serials, it applies to the whole. So if you have a serial where it's, Canadian politics and the serial is in English and French, it's parallel languages, then certainly you would do English and French here. And then you have to kind of take a look when you get to the fixed field in terms of what your choices may be in terms of those languages. In the 041, you could record both English and French there. Notes, you're going to use notes as you need, and I am a proponent of notes. Because I think they're very helpful for copy catalogers, and I know they've helped me out sometimes, and I try to return the favor when I'm original cataloging. So notes, use them as needed and as would be a good deed for someone else. So when you are cataloging that really odd serial thing, or that thing, or even an odd monograph thing, that thing that maybe it was really kind of hard to figure out what it was and to get the information together to create that record, then, kind of remember that as you're creating it, maybe add a little bit of information for the copy cataloger who may come along and need to use that record. Because even something like title varies slightly can be very useful, especially to someone who's new to copy cataloging and thinks like, well, gosh, organization, it's a Z or is an S. Mine has an S. Which is it? And it's like, oh, well, it says they're S, but then it says the newer ones use Z. So, all right, I can do, if mine fits in here, it fits in here. You can use a 515 if you have numbering peculiarities. So basically anything that seems kind of strange, or if it's uneven. And we're going to actually look at an example in a few minutes where we have uneven. A source of description in Concert, this is going to be 2. Description based on and latest issue consulted. Latest issue consulted and description based upon. So for Concert records, you should have both of them. For regular copy catalog and RDA, I would say at least, at least your 588 first one, the description based upon. That would be my suggestion. Again, if you're doing any kind of original cataloging and there's any information you should communicate to someone, please do in a note. The last fields we're going to talk about are or some of the last fields we're going to talk about are the 700 fields. And these are linking fields. You can link to other editions using a 775, and this is sort of the format of it. I kind of pulled out the most common ones, T, X, and W. T being for title, X being for ISSN, E for language. You see sometimes, and certainly a subfield W for OCLC, because that's what's going to create the link for a lot of systems. And you know, that's one of those kind of things that can be kind of helpful depending upon what your ILS should use, what your ILS will do with it and what your ILS will use. Certainly for CONSER participants or people wanting to follow the CONSER standards, if there are other editions, in this case, like an English language or Spanish language, there are other editions of your serial, you would definitely add these, and you would do it on both records. So on the English language record, you would add a link to the Spanish language one. And then on this one, we're going to link back to the English language. So it's a reciprocal relationship. Another one that you can link to is reproduction. So this would be here's how you're going to link your print and electronic together, or one choice for how you link your print and electronic together. So the 776 is for different formats. The 775 is for related manifestations, as they call them. But the 775 is really where you're going to get to kind of like different editions, different versions, so like language versions, things like that. 776 is where you're getting to different formats. So you have a print and you want to link to the online version. 776, you can link to the online version, and then on the online record, you can link to the print. So reciprocal, linking back and forth between the two. 650s, we're not going to talk too much about it because this isn't subject analysis. Oh, that's one of my favorite classes, but not subject analysis. Remember, it applies to the whole, so they're typically more general nature. Do add the form subdivision as appropriate. That'd be like subfield V, periodicals or newspapers. Yeah, that's pretty much all to say about it. I'm not going to talk too much about new records. I've kind of alluded to this topic. So we'll be talking about this a lot more in the future. But just a few notes that there's some changes that do require a new description, while other changes are recorded by modifying the existing record. And we looked at an example of that with the organization versus organization. That's considered a minor change, and it's not considered enough. It's not considered enough of a change to warrant a new record. So for that organization where they just changed the spelling of it, you know, the work itself is the same. It's like nothing really changed. They probably put a new cover on it and spelled organization with a Z. There is a section in the RDA called determining number of records that can be helpful with supplements issued in parts, reprints, etc. And I will try to see if I can print that out and just post it as a PDF so you'll have that. And the other thing that is a sort of factor in all of this is like changes in descriptive or identifying elements. So you kind of know, and then really changes in format. So changes in format's the biggest one. Oh, in copy cataloging, if there are no changes, you accept the record as is, regardless of cataloging standard. So if your thing fits in there and you can, you know, you have enough information to go on that, you're like, yeah, it fits on this record, then you're fine. You just accept what you get, you move it, take it as you see it, move it on. What you should take a look for is the 245, the 264 with those dates. 300 field, make sure your format is correct between the 336, 337, 338. And then if there's any notes on that record that give you more information that would tell you that yes, your thing fits here, or no, it doesn't, then those notes can be helpful in making that decision. You know, for this example that we looked at, I think we looked at this one earlier. Yeah, the research in the industrial organization. If you have either of these on your resource and everything else matches, you know, if you had research and industrial organization and you have something from 2012, then you're fine, because it's going to fit perfectly. If you have something in 2014 and it has organization with the Z spelled in it, it's fine. If you had something from 2018 and it back to the S, then I would say take a look at it, but it's probably fine. I would go ahead and just check the format and some of the other information that we've talked about and make sure that I really am on the right record. But more than likely, maybe they even just made a typo with that one. They really meant for it to still be Z, but they used the old template or something. Again, if there's no changes, you just accept it and you move on. A couple of more examples, but I'm just going to kind of skate through these because we're running short on time. Do take a look at this example. There's a lot of things that we talked about that you can kind of spend more time with, and I will be sharing more examples in the forums. I did want to work through an example quickly with you. So this is Bellatrix, and if you look at the website and you look at some of the publication information about Bellatrix, it is a magazine. Bellatrix Magazine is a literary arts magazine published out of Bellevue College. And they tell you a little bit about the work. So writers and artists. If you dig around, and there's some places to look for smaller publications. Certainly if you're buying it from a vendor, if you're buying a subscription plan, you're getting some subscriptions, you probably have a lot more information at your fingertips just from your vendor. If you have some things that have been donated to you, or maybe you're collecting specific sort of smaller press kinds of works, or maybe even things like this, where it's like arts and literary magazines from universities that are small press kind of things, then there's some places you can take a look. Certainly look at their website if they have one. There's also something called Duotrope, which is really more about how people get published in these magazines, but it gives a lot of information about the magazine itself. And then there's another one that's a independent press kind of organization where they also list information about magazines. So from all of those resources, we have been able to determine that we have an annual. It's published once a year. It's in print and electronic, but electronic is more of a blog website format. So there's not like an issue that you download or anything like that. We have the genre. We know it's literature and short stories with some artwork. So this would be one that I would consider illustrations for, just based upon the content that's been presented. So if I had a print copy of this, I would kind of, flip through it and do all the things you did, but I would also probably do a little bit more research because as you can see from the cover, there's not a lot here. And being a more artistic work, a lot of times there's not things like clear publication information on it because, they're trying to be creative and stuff and things like that. Also, being a small independent press, it may not have an ISSN, and this one does not. So I'm kind of at I'm kind of coming about this from a different way. So I don't have information coming from sort of these big professional resources and things like that I might have from like Time Magazine or something where it's like, oh, I know how frequently it's published and all that other kind of stuff. I'm coming at it from a small press where I'm going to have to kind of figure that out myself. So looking at their website and then doing some sleuthing around in some of these publishing sites, I know that so far there's been 4 volumes published online, at least what's available online. But then when I actually go and look and do some digging around, I find out that it was founded in 2010. So it's very obvious that the website and the print magazines do not cover the full archive. So then when I would be doing my, begin, like when did it begin from? I would know that it began in 2010, but I don't have any idea exactly when it began. And I also don't know what that frequency was at that point. But they do say all over the place that it's yearly. So I could make that assumption that it was probably yearly even back then. but I would have to maybe do a little bit more investigating. But it would be safe to say it was yearly. It started in 2010. And then if I were cataloging the latest issue, or what I had on hand might be volume 4, which is the latest issue. Now you see here they've numbered them volume 1, 2, 3, and 4. But then when actually you go to the website, and I can send you all the website so you can look at this one. But when you go actually look at it and you zoom in, the title really varies slightly because being sort of an artistic thing and a student publication kind of thing, they have not been consistent in how they've numbered these, although they are calling them volume 1, 2, 3, and 4. So we know that we can assume that they're going to call it volumes. And when we look at, if you actually scroll in and look at these, you can kind of see. So for example, and we have the publisher information. So we have a lot of good information. We have the title, we know who published it, we know the place of publication because it's published at the college. So we can infer, we can assume that it's published here at Bellevue, Washington. So we have that kind of information. We do have a little bit of information we're going to need to figure out, and the fact that we know the title varies a little bit. And how do we know the title varies? Well, because the first volume, what has been indicated as volume 1 here, has no volume numbering on it. It's just Bellatrix, a literary arts magazine. So it has no volume numbering, but it's indicated as volume 1. And I actually looked at PDFs of these and they have no volume numbering on volume 1. Volume 2, the title is Bellatrix, and then there is a volume 2, 2017, and it's exactly as that, volume 2, 2017. And then there's a subtitle, A Journal of Words and Pictures. So, you know, here's a situation where we would have a subfield A for Bellatrix, but then we would need to kind of figure out what we're going to do with these other titles. So this would be a good example of one where Bellatrix would be the whole title as a whole. And then we would have to kind of account for these titles. So title varies as a note, and then we might actually list exactly the titles for each issue, at least for these early issues. Now, being that they've gotten a lot more organized and it's the digital world, and hopefully things will continue to be kind of published the same. But as you notice here, even though these are all the same publication, what is, you know, what is interesting is like, okay, the font's not even the same. Where the layout of the title is not even the same. You know, so we have all of these kinds of things. Now, between volume 3 and 4, we did have what appears to be a standardization of the title in terms of at least the font. So, you know, it is kind of interesting when you look at these and kind of think about them through the lens of Serial's cataloging. Okay, what would I need to do with this? Well, we've got the title, we've got Bellatrix, and on the website, they call it Bellatrix Magazine. So if we were to catalog the website and we will want to do that, then because that doesn't have downloadable issues and because it is more of a blog presentation, then that would be something for us to look at to see, do we want to catalog it more as a serials, or do we want to catalog, since it is issue oriented, do we want to still catalog it as an electronic serial, or do we want to catalog it as an integrated resource and look at the website as a whole? Because the whole website's called Bellatrix Magazine, but there are individual issues there, although they're not downloadable. So we're actually going to revisit this example when we get to integrating resources and electronic resources at the end, because it's a good fun example. But for the print, we've got 4 volumes that are available, that are currently available. We don't have, we're just going to say like, yeah, we didn't get anything earlier than these 4 volumes. These came in a box to us. We didn't get any others. And we don't really know about volume 10, or we don't really know about number 10. And actually the first volume, which what they're calling volume 1, what they're calling volume 1 was issued in 2016. So what did they do between 2016 and 2010? We don't really know. So we could do a few different things. We could investigate a little bit more and we could try to determine what might have happened before then. Or since volume 1 is 2016, we could use 2016 as our date. And then we might use this founded in 2010. We might just put that in a note field so that if there was any earlier ones that came up, or maybe the ones that would be before might be a different title, then, at least there'd be some record in our note that like there was something happened before 2016. But we actually have volume 1 of Bellatrix. So volume 1 of Bellatrix is 2016. So that would be where I would be most likely to start with. Like volume 1 is 2016. I'm going to add 2016 for my dates of when this started. And, if I have all of these, then, that does give me a little bit more to kind of work with, but it gives me a little bit more of a challenge at the same time, because then I'm going to have to account for the fact that title varies between these. It all starts with Bellatrix. It's just what do they do without after that. So for 2 of them, Bellatrix is a literary arts magazine. Bellatrix is a journal of words and pictures, and then it just becomes Bellatrix. So, would that be a title change? I wouldn't necessarily consider it to be a title change, because I think the title is the title would be a minor enough title change, but it's one of those things where you'd have to kind of really look at it, and you could probably argue either way. I would consider it to be relatively minor because the main part of the title, the Bellatrix, stayed the same. They just couldn't decide if they wanted to kind of give it a subtitle or, give it a continuing next continuing part of a title or not. So, they kind of went back and forth. They were Bellatrix, a literary arts magazine, then it was a journal of words, and then they just went to Bellatrix, and that's what it's been since 2018. So we have that information. If we have volume 4 in print, it was 29 centimeters, heavily illustrated. So I would look at illustrations for both my 300 field, and I might even add illustrations into the 336, because you can have multiples of those fields. So I might go ahead and add some illustrations in there. Things to investigate, certainly beyond some of the things we've talked about with the dates and stuff. I would also, of course, investigate the access points. I'd want to give an access point probably for the college at least, maybe for this organization or whoever oversees this publication. So I need to investigate that a little bit more. Certainly I need to determine my call numbers, and I can use my MARC cheat sheet and Concert cheat sheet to kind of cover this. But I've got volume numbering, so I know what my volume numbering is. I've got my frequency, so I know what my frequency is. This is published in the English language, so I've got my language. So I've got a lot of the information I need to just create that record, and I'm not going to have an ISSN because this one doesn't have one. So that would be sort of the difference between like what we might do with that, do with another. So once you have determined your call number and access points, then you can create your record using a serials work form, or you can deriving it from an existing record. So you can actually, if you're an OCLC, you can actually copy records and then use that as a basis for what you're doing. Kind of depends upon what you want to do with it. So as we wrap up here, next steps, study the MARC records that I'm going to share with you, work through the quiz and exercises, which I will get up as soon as I can. And on that note, have a great day, and I hope you have lots of things to think about, and have a good evening. Talk to you later.